Recorded at Get a Grip Studios in Toronto, Canada. A Get a Grip management production and in association with the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast. Financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors and presented by the National Lighting Bureau, the Illuminating Engineering Society, and the International Dark Sky Association. Added to the IES's 2021 Progress Report. This is Starving for Darkness, a podcast. Hey folks, before we get into Starving for Darkness here, my co-host from the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast, Gregory Eric, and I are going to tell you real quick about some magicians we know at Evluma. That's EVLUMA.com. And you hover over products, that's right, and click on Dark Sky Friendly, Greg. You got to check out the magicians at Evluma, EVLUMA.com, Greg Eric.
How many lighting manufacturers, I should say, are actually doing this? None, other than Evluma. They're the only ones that are actually focusing on it, putting product out there and saying, hey, we're going to tackle this issue head on, and we have product for you. They cover it right there. You'll see it on the website. Kelvin temperature. They've got them all, 2K up to 5K.
2K,
Lensing.
not 27K, 2K, brother.
And they have 22K.
Yeah.
You know, that's something that not everybody has, or not anybody has. Lensing. Diffusion, shields, and then dimming. Of course, you want dimming. You always talk about it, the importance of that in exterior lighting. They've got it all with their products.
You got to go to EVLUMA.com, hover over products, and click Dark Sky Friendly Lighting. Right now, here comes Starving for Darkness.
Hello, listeners and darkness lovers. Welcome to another episode of Starving for Darkness. My name is Jane Slade. I'm here with my co-host, Michael Colligan. And today, I'm so pleased to announce that our podcast was accepted into the 2021 Progress Report by the Illuminating Engineering Society. Yes, darkness is progress. And today, we are thrilled to bring on our next guest and my friend, Dr. Rajaram Bhagavathula. Dr. Bhagavathula is a senior research associate in the Division of Vehicle, Driver, and System Safety at Virginia Tech Transportation Institute. His research is focused on the human factors of the built environment, specifically lighting, and he aims to understand the effects of lighting on roadway user health, safety, and behavior. So, Dr. Bhagavathula, thank you so much. And I'm just going to call you Raj, like I do when we're chatting. Raj, it's so nice to have you on as a friend and as a colleague. And we start every show with the same request, which is please tell us about a dark sky experience that left you in a place of awe.
I have actually two.
Great.
The first one, I'm from India, if you can't tell by now, or with my name. But so I remember going on a field trip in 10th grade to like a nearby a place in the mountains. It's close to my hometown in the south of India, and my city was industrial. It was like a industrial city. It had a huge steel plant and everything. So it's like the pollution was a major issue. We couldn't really see the night sky really well. But in 10th grade, I remember taking a field trip, and we got delayed on the way back. And we were coming back at night through the mountains, and then I happened to look up at the night sky. And I was just taken aback by just the beauty of the enormous nature, like what I am missing by not looking, by being in a polluted city versus in a clean, a small hill town where you can actually see the Milky Way with your naked eye, and that was mind-blowing for me. It completely changed. And the same thing happened, and I posted a picture on Instagram today on the eve of being on this podcast about night sky in Death Valley, which is a Class 1 dark sky park in the U.S. And I had dinner that night, and I walked out of the hotel. And this is they said the hotel was basically this is the most light polluted area in the park, but even there, sitting outside and looking at the sky just blew my mind. It was so hot, like 110 degrees, but still just the night sky was just like looking at the stars and the colors. It was breathtaking.
Hmm.
And I'm a photographer, so I I kind of feel sad every time I look at the night sky, even in my hometown, in the town that I live in now, and like not being able to see like even half of it
Hmm.
is and then the fact that the kids these days, if you're living in a city, you can't even see anything other than the moon. So it's I feel bad and sad that these kids really can't experience the beauty of the night sky.
And what's your
Yeah.
second story?
So I told too. The one is my trip from high school, and then the second one is in Death Valley. Sorry, both of
Ah,
them
I
were
see.
interspersed by about 20 years. So
Yes.
sorry, I should have
I
clarified
caught
that.
it.
But
Don't worry, I caught it. That's
yeah,
okay. I caught it.
sorry
I
about it,
see.
Sam.
I see. No worries. So, Raj, I think it's really funny now because I first met you at the 2014 IES annual conference, which is actually taking place this week for the 2021
Mhm.
conference. And it was right after Neil deGrasse Tyson gave his keynote, and we opened up into a ballroom to have cocktails. And there you were. And it's just funny that we should be meeting after, a really great keynote by an astrophysicist. And so your work, you really focus on the roadway environment. And I wanted
Yep.
to dig into what you actually researched. So one of
Hmm.
your most recent publications was the impact of LED roadway lighting on driver sleep, health, and alertness. Can you talk about
Yep.
your research process and your findings?
So basically, one of the big goals of this project, and especially with the LED, lighting, is that there's this whole thing that LED lighting is, rightfully so. Some of the wavelengths are not good for human circadian rhythm. If you get exposed to those lights, there's research that shows that it disrupts your circadian rhythms and your circadian entrainment. And there's also a part of research that shows that if you get exposed to these lights with high blue content at night, it might improve your alertness. But the research on alertness is kind of a mixed bag, and it's pretty context specific. So it depends on what you're doing. So one of the things that came from the fallout, like in 2016, AMA came out and said LED roadway lighting is bad for human health and everything else. And one of the things we wanted to do as a part of the study, and there's another part of the study that's ongoing that is funded by the Department of Energy. I'm not going to talk about that, but this is the one that's finished and ready to go. Uh, but this is basically trying to understand, especially from a roadway driver perspective, what does it do to driving behavior? Does it make the drivers more alert at night, or does it suppress their melatonin, which is not a full-time indicator of sleep health, but it's unfortunately that is the only thing that they can actually test very quickly instead of doing like a long-term study to figure out what kind of impact it has on their long-term health, to see if it suppresses melatonin, which is the hormone that is basically lets your body know that it's time to sleep. So so we looked at those things, and then we also looked at how much light you're getting from other devices like cell phones or watching TV, or if you're reading a Kindle at night before you're going to bed, or what you're watching something on your iPad. We wanted to compare the exposures that you get from these devices versus how much would a driver get if they're exposed for a similar period of time when they're driving at night. So that's basically the gist of that study. And then our results showed that it really didn't improve alertness in a driving context. There was not much of melatonin suppression as well compared to other, in terms of again the dosage that they got from roadway lighting to no lighting as well. The fact that you're in a car with the headlamps that deflects the light, there's not a lot of statistical differences between the amount of between the between that and no lighting conditions. So it's not a lot of light that you're getting from driving at night in a lighted environment for 2 hours.
I find that interesting because I know that the iPhone, when it's up next to our eyes, actually has a
Yeah.
lot of circadian stimulation, but the
Hmm.
TV doesn't. So are
Yeah.
you kind of saying it's like a similar factor where the lighting is sort of so far away from the retina that it's not suppressing melatonin as a result?
So the dosage is pretty low. Like if you have, so what we did was we looked at So we went over. So IES kind of specifies 1.1 cannula per meter square. That's the highest level specified for roadways. So we went to 1.2, I think. So we went to 1.5 to see if you go, but that's 25% over the specified level. That's the average luminance of the roadway. So it's really bright. So we went and we looked at that. So the amount of light, drivers are a unique situation because they're seated behind the windshield in a car, and the windshield itself has a transmissivity loss. So whatever you're seeing through the windshield, and depending on, like, typically most of the commercial windshields are like 70-80% light loss. So 80%, so you only see 80% of the light that's entering it. So, and then so that in that particular situation, so these results, the context is really important. So for drivers specifically who are driving from 1 to 3 a.m. in the morning, we haven't seen an immediate suppression in melatonin. That doesn't mean that if you keep driving for 5 years of your life at night, there wouldn't be any effects. We don't know. And if anybody else wants to fund that study at that point, we are really interested in doing a long-term study on melatonin suppression to see how that impacts. And that makes sense because if you're watching TV at home, most of the people are watching TV at night, right? Nobody's watching it during, everybody works during the day. So what happens if you watch TV from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. to 10 p.m.? We don't know. Every day for 5 years of your life, what kind of impacts it has on your sleep health and your long-term sleep physiology, we really don't know. So these are the things that need to be looked into more detail. But that specific scenario we're talking about drivers, we haven't seen enough evidence to show that it makes any kind of impact.
What about the dashboard? I find that when I'm driving, I find the dashboard extremely bright at night, and I need to turn it down. And then when I get in the car the next day to turn it on during the day, it's very dim. But I'm aware, long before I started doing Starving for Darkness, I found that dashboards have become brighter and brighter and brighter and brighter over the last 15, 20 years, to the point where it's very, very offensive. It's right in your eyes. Does that have the same effect as the iPhone in your eyes stimuli?
I'm completely aware of what you're talking about because I remember when I got my new car, this was like 4 years ago, driving one night, the screen was so blue and it was freaking distracting.
Yeah,
I had to find. I was using that screen to navigate, but at some point I had enough that I decided to turn off the screen and just drive. Because and then the thing is, blue lights it's more glaring for drivers. So in general for your eyes, it's so. The brightness perception is a little more, you perceive them to be more brighter if it has higher amounts of blue. And that's a good question. And especially if you looked at the Tesla's interior dashes, they have
it's ridiculous. Yeah, it's basic. Yeah, it's very, very, I don't know what the right word is. I think it's worse than my phone in my face, to be honest with you. It's because you're not even looking at it in a way, because it's hitting you from this angle from below. There's something going on there. I think it prevents visual acuity while looking down the road as well. I feel like I can see much better when I turn when I dim the graphical user interface.
Yeah. And there's been some studies that show that like white light, like broad spectrum light, like white has more white, is better at increasing your peripheral vision. So basically the sights. Yeah. So maybe that's kind of like having that kind of that white light or bluish white light kind of really affects your periphery, and especially if you're at night. Typically, most of the time, you use your periphery to detect. In low light conditions, you use your periphery to detect objects. So, because your foveal, your periphery is more helpful in low light conditions. So, yeah. So in this study, we used like a normal. Our car, we put it at I don't remember, like 0.2 or 0.3 lux. So it's not a lot of light from the indoors. It's an older. The 2016 model didn't have like any fancy big touch screens inside the car. It's a standard car that we used. But that did not so that we accounted for that light when we were measuring. So we didn't turn those lights off from the dash of the car. But that's another aspect of it that we're really interested in looking at, is especially if you're doing these long distance drives with these like with the vehicles that have these extensive touch screens inside, and we don't know what what kind of effect that does have on people's circadian, or actually melatonin suppression or long-term circadian health.
It seems really obvious to me that if you're trying to look out into the distance of darkness, that you wouldn't want to put bright lights in the foreground.
Yes.
But I'm not a car designer, and I just think car designers are not lighting designers. And Mike, you're really lucky that that's even a setting that you can adjust. I bought a new TV, and there was a setting to adjust the light level of the TV, and it's on the lowest, and I wish it could go lower, but it won't.
I totally know what
There's
you mean.
no setting for that. So, yeah.
I find that I same thing with me. I only watch very little TV, but when I sit down, and my kids watch more than me and my wife, when I sit down in front of the TV, my eyes hurt right away. The first thing that happens to me is I feel like this pressure on my eyes, and then I get used to it. But yeah, there's definitely something with those dashboards. Have you guys studied temporal light modulation or saccadic precepts or any of these flicker issues with respect to roadway lighting? Because let me just preface it, because we've had several dark sky fans and darkness fans email us, and they talk about epileptic seizures. They talk about extreme headaches and nausea when driving at night. And they were attributing this, Raj, to the color temperature of the light. But as the host of the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast, I'm very familiar with the effects of flicker, or temporal light modulation, and the saccadic percept thing that's going on when you're moving very quickly across light planes and they're flickering. And not a doctor, not a scientist, but it seemed to correlate more with the flicker issue than it did with any color rendering. Have you guys considered looking into that as a possible human health hazard or a driving hazard?
So we have not, and I'll tell you what. And then it'll become a huge issue going forward. Is one of the things that I know that you had my boss on, Dr. Ron Gibbons, before, and he talked about adaptive lighting. And one of the things that we see, and this flicker shows up, is when you dim the lights to about 20 or 30%. Mm-hmm. When you dim it to lower light levels, that's when your flicker's more. You can actually see the flicker more clearly. But
that's when it impacts everybody. Okay.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, but like, some people,
it will impact if you go into a place with flickering LED lights, like when they've dimmed them, and it's just it feels gross. Like everybody, as soon as you point it out to somebody, they notice it and they can't take it anymore. But there are people that are much more sensitive, Raj, to flicker.
Right. Yeah, and that's true. That is true. And I actually know a couple of people, and I'm a part of the Vision Science Committee. So that's one of the things that the committee is working on is addressing flicker and having metrics for flicker and making it more standardized, that people are more aware of it. And they're champions for that. Naomi Miller at PNNL.
Oh, for sure. The queen of flicker.
Yeah, and then so I sit in those meetings, and that's not an area that I know much about. But what I know is that is a huge issue. And the other thing is there's also the that you said, the flicker from the LED, and the other thing is relative motion, right? You're driving.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's worse when you're driving through it than when you're standing below it.
You are compounding it, and if you have roadway lighting that is not properly designed, or that's not very uniform, or if there's a lot of dark and bright bands, that your speed can actually create a more of a flicker in itself, right? Mm-hmm. Because as you're driving through space and time, you're changing the light pattern. So there are all these aspects that need to be looked at that we haven't really had a chance to catch up on yet. In terms of
if you get a fidget spinner, the fidget spinners, if you take a fidget spinner and go stand under your streetlights, listeners, and spin the fidget spinner, if you see a modulation, that's the light flicking off and on. And you can see it on a fidget spinner. You just spin the fidget spinner and it'll flicker. And if you see that, then those lights are going off and on 60 times a second, from 0 to 100, from 0 to 100. And I have to think that the speed combined with the modulation and those saccadic precepts that are impacting your eyes as you're driving has to create safety issues and health issues for people.
There's So one thing is in terms of safety, we have like different kinds of LEDs on our test track here in terms of the ability of the driver to detect objects or hazards on the roadway, like pedestrians or small objects. We haven't seen huge differences when you compare LEDs to the traditional lights, like more the older light sources, like legacy light sources, like hypnotic sodium. We haven't seen huge differences there in terms of if you match the light levels. In terms of yes, there's a slightly better performance of 4K, especially for smaller objects. But in general, we haven't seen like huge performance differences. That means that they might. That doesn't mean that they're not there. Just doesn't mean that they're not big enough to be able to notice it. But we isolate all the things. So I think we did a good job of isolating all the external factors. But doesn't mean that they don't, because if it's a perception, right? If you're not something that you're quantitatively measuring, or you cannot measure, if it's a feeling like glare, these things are hard to measure because it's a subjective reaction to it. Your perception to glare is dependent on so many other factors. Like for instance, how you slept last night, what kind of light exposure did you have in the last 5 days? Did you drink alcohol last night? So all these things affect. There's a lot of subjective aspects to it that affect your perceptions. So in terms of quantitatively, I might not perform the same, but subjectively there might be some differences, and these are things that we should keep looking at as we go forward into as more and more local municipalities start adopting LEDs, and that's happening every day. So like, how do we make this more safer and more better and more efficient for everybody? Essentially, that should be going forward.
So Raj, you've researched driver behavior under specific lighting conditions. Can you talk about some interesting facts you've uncovered?
So one of the things, like what we thought was, like if you look at the recent report that I talked about, where we looked at how people drive. So we looked at 3 different measures. So one, we looked at how far can people detect these obstacles when they're driving at night. And the second one is we looked at how well they're able to keep their lane positioning in the vehicle. And we also looked at how sleepy are they getting in the car. And we made the task as boring as we can. Night driving is typically very uneventful. If you're driving on a highway at night, typically very uneventful. So we did not even put a lot of objects. So we had like 50% of the objects that are supposed to be blank. So there's nothing there. And there's only 50% of the time you see something that's very randomized. What we found out that though is for all the LEDs, the performance over time. So what we looked at is how their detection performance was changing. So every half an hour when they were driving, or we looked at every lap. So every lap is one circle around the test track. What we saw is for all the LEDs, the performance was pretty straightforward. It was not changing over lap, But for HPS, it started off higher in the beginning. They were performing better. And then as the time progressed, as you got into a 2 hour, as you're getting to 1.5 hour, 2 hours, the performance kind of dipped lower and lower than the LED. So, and that was the.
Why do you think that was?
So there's 2 aspects of it. One is you can just straight up say, hey, SPD, it's like alertness is dropping off, people are sleeping off better. But I would say that's very, very short-sighted, because the 2 things are the LED and the HPS have different uniformities. And this again comes back to...
And just for listeners, HPS is high-pressure sodium. It's a sort of antiquated light
source. Or the orange-colored light of street lights, the orange-colored light street light type that have largely gone the way of the dinosaur. But yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I go into these things and I try to thank you for that. But yeah, so the hypnotic sodium, this yellow light, you think that it has a different uniformity. So it has a different, the way the light is distributed. So there's a difference in it has a more of a dark and light pattern as you drive. And then HPS, the LEDs, it's more uniform. That means that the road is very, very uniformly lit. There's not a lot of bright and dark patches if you look at it. So we think that it's a combination of both. And this again goes back to a little bit of flicker there, and then the fatigue. So if you constantly see these bright and dark bands of light as you drive for 2 hours on a lighted road, maybe it's just visual fatigue after It's just your eyes get tired, and then you're not detecting these objects from that far away anymore. That's the one. And the other one we saw was in terms of being able to keep the vehicles between the lanes. There was no difference in any of the LED or the HPSs. In terms of, we also asked for a subjective rating of sleepiness. So every half an hour, we would just wake them up and say, "Hey, how sleepy do you think you are?" And they would give you a rating on like 1 to 6 or something, 1 to 10 or 1 to 6, I think. So it's got a Karolinska sleepiness scale. And then everybody were pretty sleepy in all lighting conditions. It doesn't matter whether it's LED or HPS or no lighting. In fact, if this is one of the things that I was expecting, was that people were able to drive better when there was no lighting, because they had to be more awake to be able to keep their car in between the two lanes. Versus when there's lighting, people relax a little more. They can see more stuff. So whereas with no lighting, they're like, "Oh my God, I need to make sure there's no additional lighting for guidance. I need to like really focus on the road." So if there's a slight difference where drivers were able to, it's called the measure is called standard deviation of lateral position. It's like how frequently are they veering off the central lane of the lane. So we saw that under the no lighting conditions, the number of deviations that they had, the amount of deviation that they had was a little lower than the lighted conditions. So yeah, so there's a bunch of.
So hang on a second here. I just want to understand this better. So roadway lighting decreased driver attention to the road, or decreased
not significant. No.
What is it that you're describing here exactly? So the people were more alert without roadway lighting?
Very, very, very minor, not a huge measure.
Yeah, but if you extrapolate that across things, that's a major impact. Yeah. Like a little 1% or 0.5% over
no, it's not even. It's so statistically. My analysis told me it's just noise.
Noticed.
We saw.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just noise. Sorry, not. It's just like random variation of the data. It's not something. Maybe if we do this 100 more times, maybe we can see something. Maybe.
Okay.
Not sure yet. It's a slight trend there, but not something very, very that sticks out and say, "Oh, this is something that's really important."
Yeah, but you said it.
Yes, I said it. So that's why I'm kind of trying to make sure that. But typically, right, if you're driving on a roadway when there's no lighting, you are more alert, right? You're trying to be more attentive than like if you're driving at night. Just imagine yourself driving on a highway where you know that if it's a lighted highway, you are a little more in terms of your visual behavior. You can see things from far off than when there's no lighting and just you're relying on headlamps and you're driving at 45 miles an hour or 40 miles an hour. You are a little more attentive because you want to make sure that it's you're not hitting anybody. So yeah.
What interests me about that specific topic is I often talk about casinos and how casinos use light to create circadian stimulus to make people think it's daytime, removing the clocks, pumping oxygen in, and all these things they do. Did you notice at all, like at night, there's like a hypnotic effect of people driving in brighter light where they seem like they're like, it's not like they're in a trance, but they're kind of like a flock of birds flying and they kind of go together down the road? Did you observe any trends or anything like that where there's like people move into like a sort of a different brain mode where they're actually not attentive? Their secondary lizard brain or whatever you want to call it is driving the car. Did you observe anything like that?
Not in this study, but in this study, everybody were equally sleepy. So we also, in addition to that, they were pretty drowsy by the end of the 2 hours that we were on the road. And this was like 3 a.m. in the morning by the time they finished the study. We also looked at, there's a measure that we use for drowsiness in driving. It's called per-close. It essentially means percentage of eyes closed in a 3-minute segment. So if you're more drowsy, you're more falling asleep. So your eyes close for a longer period of time in a 3 minute. So you pick like standard 3-minute intervals, and then you look at what percentage of the time were the eyes closed. So we saw that there's no difference in terms of those measures, irrespective of what lighting conditioning. And coming back to your question about, there's this thing called moth effect, where in highway driving, where people actually see a light source and then they just run into the light source. And a lot of the police vehicles have this issue where you're driving at night and you see one light source there, nothing else, and then you just drive into that. And there was a study that one of my colleagues conducted. We were able to essentially replicate it with. So basically, that is, we have a documented case where he did the one of the participants did run off, and those things are true. Yeah, and people gravitate towards light sources when there's no lighting around, and there's definitely that aspect of it. But in this particular study, we did not do anything. But when we had a single source of light on the road, like a police vehicle with the lights on or something, we did really see that.
That has happened so many times in Ontario, where people have driven right into police cars that are stopped on the side of the road. And now they have a law that says you have to change lanes or you can get ticketed. Right? But isn't that interesting? It's called the moth. I think it's happened even amongst streetlights, because the police car is so bright on the side of the road. Isn't that interesting? That's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating.
Well, this is very supportive of what Peter Vito was saying on an episode we recorded, which is that the visual system actually is going for the brightest thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, when you're presenting these really bright things, and I recently had a cop car stopped in my neighborhood, and I could see how the blue lights were turning the entire facade of this apartment building blue. And I just thought, wow, so somebody had a traffic violation and now an entire residential building is being illuminated with blue light at 10 p.m. at night.
Flickering
Seems
too.
a little
flickering
with blue light. Yeah. So I think that the that cop cars in their wanting to alert and using light to do that have probably taken it too far, to the point, as what you're saying, Raj, of creating actual traffic accidents, or what you're saying, Mike, with what you're seeing in Ontario. Now, Raj, you recently published an article in Popular Science entitled, "Our Street Lighting Doesn't Need to Be This Bad." What makes our current lighting bad? And
it's like singing to the choir at this point.
In an ideal world, what would make it better? So what makes it bad? What would make it better?
So the bad, and let me preface that by saying that it's not bad because people want it to be bad. It's not bad. It's bad because we did not have a lot of the tools that we have now. Like, for instance, with HPSs, we had dimmable drivers, but they were not great. Like, they were not fantastic. They had that huge lead up time to dimming, and then with the HPSs, essentially you had a lot of energy that was being converted to heat, right? It's not as efficient as the LED. And with LEDs, so we were going, and then our approach to lighting was not very evidence-based or based on research. We were not looking at why do we need light there, how much light do we need, why do we really want light there. So these are things that we did not consider before, like partly because there are a lot of these towns and like governments have these warrants, like if there's minimum 2 or 3 night crashes a year, you have to have lighting there. So, but we haven't really had a chance to look at, or we didn't have the way to measure how does light actually impact driver behavior or crashes at night. So we did not know that, and because basically we did not have the technology to do stuff. But now with the data collection, the ability to collect, like we have a lighting system which we can collect in situ lighting data as you drive on the highway, so we can actually assign these these nodes are these GPS coordinates saying the light level of this coordinate is so and so, and it's how we can actually use that data, compare that data to crashes that are happening at night, and say, okay, what is the light level, and what is the effect of increasing light level in crashes? And a couple of my papers are looking at what light level should we dim to, so that you can actually make sure that the crashes are you're not. You cannot reduce all the crashes at night just because you have lighting. Most of the crashes happen because there's like multiple factors. Like if you're under the influence, if you're distracted, no matter how much light you put there, it's not going to avoid a crash. You're going to be a crash anyway. So basically, the whole point of the article,
or it might create a crash.
my actually one of a big concern is as I interact with a lot of the state DOTs is putting lighting at night. For them, a major consider is like a fixed object off the side of the road. So, for instance, if there's no lighting and if you run off the road, right, you might just go into a field and just stop somewhere. Whereas if you put a huge pole there, if you hit the pole, you're going to die for sure at high speed.
Well,
So that's a big trade-off. Like if you have to put lighting, they have to consider guardrails and things like that would actually absorb the shock and reduce the energy and dissipate the energy, and so that the people will not die from hitting a fixed object that's the side of the road. So there's all these, but in general, like the whole way of looking at it is to consider what are the needs of a lighting system and what is the lighting system actually addressing in that particular area.
Yes.
If there is environmental issue, if there is a safety issue, if there is a crime issue, if there is, so looking at it from a more holistic way, and if you determine that there is a need for lighting, then add lighting.
Jane,
and then
I'm interrupting you because I just have to say this. He just said that our approach to lighting was not evidence-based. Did you hear that?
Oh yeah, I already have a comment, which is that, because we did 1-for-1 replacements, which completely changed from the lighting technology of high-pressure sodium to LEDs with absolutely no care for the absolute change in optics. So that was not evidence-based. That was just plopping one thing in for another. Most of it was.
Oh my God, what's the matter with us humans, man? Why are we so dumb? Why are we so dumb? I just it drives me crazy. Come on, we can do so much better than this, Raj. We can do so much better.
If you want to feel bad about the human race in general, like the species, you should read a book called *Sapiens*.
I read *Sapiens*. Yeah,
it kind of gives you a much better perspective on how.
I don't like Noah Yuval Harari. I don't like that guy. I'm not a big fan of him. He's a bit of an anti-natalist too. So, but Jane, can I just jump in on this right now? Can I?
Jump in.
Yeah. So, have you guys ever taken the approach that lighting is bad? Like, instead of because with the axiomatic presupposition, which guides all of this nonsense, is that if you have a problem at night, you can solve it by putting light there. And the more light you put, the better. And the more uniform it is, the better. And the higher Kelvin temperature it is, the better. And now everybody knows that you've done something. And there's like this default to action. Something happens. People have to do something. And when it involves the night, it means you have to put a light there. And have we ever started off with saying, like liability, saying you put a light there and that's what caused the problem or that's what is the issue? Have we ever started from the axiomatic presupposition that light at night is actually a negative and not less of a positive, or it needs to be engineered better or something? Have we ever started from the other end of the argument, Raj?
So looking at it from the other end of the argument, is number one, is that we don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
Number two is I can't really talk about the details. We've looked at some research, especially one of the biggest concerns right now is pedestrian safety at night. Over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of pedestrian crashes at night, and there are some strategies that does not involve lighting, like putting some signs or flashing beacons at night. So in a recent study, we've looked at that. We looked at how does lighting perform, too. So we looked at overhead lighting, like a pole, and you put a light 30 feet. We also looked at a small spotlight that goes on a sign pole that just lights the sidewalk. There's a crosswalk and nothing else. So our results show that, without going into great detail, that having a little bit of light goes a long way if you have a crosswalk that has a higher speed limit, because it's not just like it's again, you have to look at the whole systemic perspective. I follow some researchers that look at kinds of crashes that are happening at night to figure out that in the U.S. the number of SUVs have increased as a percentage of cars in the U.S. The number of SUVs have increased. So these have higher bodies and these are heavier. So when they hit somebody, they transfer more energy to the pedestrian. So the fatality, if it's in the SUV, is higher There's higher alcohol, driving under the influence. There's a lot of other factors. So one of the things I said is going to your question, I don't think you're having crashes because of lighting, but I think that, I also, again, say that lighting is not the way to, is not the only way for safety at night. There's other aspects of it, like typically on speeds higher than 25 miles an hour, you're overdriving your headlamps at that point in time. They do provide some benefit to you, but at speeds like 35 or higher, and so having some additional light on the crosswalk, or if it's a mid-block crosswalk, it's in the middle of the road, it's not an intersection, having some additional light does seem to have some benefit. But then again, we have to determine what that light is. Do we have a pedestrian crossing there? How many pedestrians are crossing from that area? And what's the trade-off? These are the things that we have to look at before we put lighting. And if there is like an endangered species there, like what happens to the light? What kind of control measures that you're taking to reduce those things? So looking at it from a more holistic point of view instead of just trying to say, and in some cases, lighting might not be the way to go. You have to do something else to have a foot-over bridge. And I don't know what they're called in the U.S., but in India they're called foot-over bridges. So where you build a small pedestrian bridge over the roads for people to cross. So maybe if there's a lot of traffic volume, you do that. So there are all these things that need to be considered, but I don't know if I can say that lighting is the concern in terms of like traffic safety, which is my area of expertise, or driver behavior, is because the data that we have shows, and I also do not agree with going to 5K or 6K. I think what we have seen is 3 and 4K are kind of decent in terms of, with 4K we are seeing, between 4 and 3K we are seeing some performance difference, like drop off from 4K to 3K, but it might not be that important.
That's between HPS and LED, not between LED 4K and LED 3K.
No, we have some data with LEDs too that shows at higher speeds 4K LED is better, slightly better than 3K. In terms of,
and when is 6K being specified?
No, I just said 6K because we have one lighting system that's 6K on the road here. So we had one, but we don't use 6K. But I don't think I think the only place where 6K is deployed is probably Alaska, very early on in the LED adoption process. So, but in general, yeah, I think it's. Going back, the context is really important. Like what are we trying to do here? Yeah.
So you've examined factors about running red lights. Can you talk about that?
Man, that goes back a long way. That was one of the first studies I've worked on. Is basically how looking at driver behavior as they're approaching an intersection, and trying to see how do we predict a guy who's going to violate versus a person who's not going to go through. So we've put a data collection system on like 3 intersections in the town close by, and then we collected data for about 6 months and looked at the data and just determined that there's like a lot of other factors that goes into like speed, how fast you're going, it's not. You don't need a scientist to tell you that if you go fast enough, it takes long for you. You can't stop at a red sign, so things like that. So if you're a heavy truck, it's harder to stop because you're carrying more momentum. You can't stop. Headway, like how far, how clearly you can see the intersection from. So if you're coming off a mountain and suddenly there's an intersection there, that apparently makes a huge difference. So things like that, yeah. So I think speed.
I would also say that some lights are programmed to be more annoying, and that would probably be a factor too, where the timing is not quite in sync with the way the traffic works.
Yeah.
But that's
that study that I did was pre-LED, and this was before my time as a lighting scientist. So I was more of a driving a traffic person then. Yeah. So that did not have a lot of like a lot of it was not, the analysis was not lighting based. It was just trying to look at trends for like why do people violate when they're driving when they're approaching an intersection.
I see. Well, you recently wrote an article about how retroreflective gear is really important for keeping pedestrians safe and bicyclists safe. And I love that. Actually, again, referencing Peter Vito, he said that on our show that if we want to keep people safe, we have to illuminate in such a way that they are illuminated in their form during daylight. So
Yeah.
by putting gear and actually creating that form. But I love that you are suggesting this because here we are, all three of us in the lighting industry, and I've often said our problem is that if I have a hammer, everything is a nail. And so you're actually suggesting a non-hammer nail tool there,
Yes.
which is not lighting at all. And so can you talk about, where you were coming from when you wrote that article?
So my so like one of the things that my boss tells, and I agree with him in this, Ron Gibbons, he says, is that we are lighting people. So we, our goal is,
So am I guess.
yeah. So it's a goal is to look at, again, looking at pedestrian safety. It's like just because you add lighting, it's not going to solve everything. It's not panacea, right? It's not going to take care of everything else in an established world peace. You just put a light there and you get everything. It doesn't work that way. It hardly works that way. Our goal is to look, especially for that particular study, we were looking at how do we make pedestrians more conspicuous at night? Like how do we, so in a realistic condition, there were all these studies that were conducted in laboratories that showed if you highlight human form, humans are more perceived to pick up. If you put a retroreflective marker on your elbows and joints, and they highlight the human form, a lot of studies showed that in test track environments, in a very sterile, there's nothing else, it's just darkness, you can actually pick up humans. So what we wanted to do was, hey, is this going to work if we take it out and put it on a real road when there's a lot of visual clutter behind? Like, if you take a typical nighttime urban roadway, you're not the only one that's emitting light, or if you're reflecting light off, there's like traffic cones, there's like other things, there's flashing lights everywhere, there's signs. So what we did was we looked at a bunch of bicyclists and pedestrians. Actually, typically we only looked at bicyclists. We looked at what happens if you wear a reflective marker versus you put a flashing light on a bicycle, or if you put those flashing spoke lights on the bicycle. What is the best way to make a bicycle more conspicuous to a driver at night? So what essentially in that study, what we found out that if you have a flashing light, in addition to having a retroreflective marker, it's better for increasing your conspicuity as a bicyclist. You want to make yourself as a big target as possible so that people can see you from far away. And one of the drawbacks of a retroreflective marker is that it depends on the amount of light that is being reflected, right? So the concept of retroreflection is that the bead or the material reflects the light back in the same direction. Typically, if you hit a surface, lights get scattered everywhere. And this particular material can reflect the light back. That's why you can see it from farther away. But then that assumes that you have a headlamp that you can see it from. Or
Right.
it's beyond the range of the headlamps, right? So I think a typical range of a headlamp is about 100 meters or 300 feet. So if you're farther than 300 feet and you're driving at 55 miles an hour, a vehicle traveling at 55 miles an hour needs about 500 feet to be able to stop safely. At 55, you hit the brakes under standard perception reaction time. If the driver is aware and he hits the brake really hard, it takes about 500 feet to stop. So in those conditions, right, if you are just relying on retroreflection, the driver doesn't get enough distance to be able to stop safely, and that's why you can have a crash. So in addition to retroreflection, you need to have some kind of a small flashing lamp or red light, something that actually tells you from farther away that there's somebody there and you need to slow down. So there's the other ways and stuff. You can't have lighting everywhere. So you need, as pedestrians, especially if you're walking or running at night, it's really important, or biking at night, it's really important to keep yourself safe, and you paint yourself as much of a bigger target as possible.
So, Raj, I wanted to ask you your research because, I remember first coming to your talks and papers at conferences, and I loved that you were really controlling light and trying to use it uh, only as needed and then turn lights off, which is an innovation in today's lighting industry to turn lights off when we're not using them. And so, what is your why, though? Because is your why the safety of humans, or is it also about the environment? I'm just asking about you and your why.
My why, is 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 both. Is
Hmm.
is safe. How can we make it safe for everyone while minimizing the impact on everything else? And and one of the things that is yes, recently the um, the editorial by Kevin Hauser, he talked about how human-centric
Yeah.
lighting is like it's very bad because you're saying it's based up for you, but it's not just human-centric lighting. I think it should be like I don't know. I know there's a term for it. I'm just gonna say it's ecocentric lighting or something. We should maybe
Mm.
we are a part of the ecology. We are animals are a part of the ecology. The plants and everything are a part of the ecology. So I think we should go from a more of a human-centric approach, which essentially everything humans do is human-centric. So we should go from a more of a human-centric approach to a more of ecocentric, looking at the surrounding ecology, what kind of effects the environment on it, or light pollution, like what kind of effects is that having on everything else, like, and going back to the holistic aspect of lighting, not just safety aspect. And then there are certain situations where if you're near a turtle nesting ground, that takes priority. And if you
Hmm.
are in an area where there are a lot of pedestrians are dying in crashes, maybe that pedestrian safety takes it. Like if it's like an urban or not, if it's a mid-block crosswalk somewhere, that takes priority. And yeah, so there's a lot of these. It's like we're trying to be more context aware of lighting. So that
I
that's the
love the
solution. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the term ecocentric lighting, and I actually hate the term human-centric lighting. And Mike, actually, it came up on my phone, but it was 2 years ago, this day or yesterday, that you and I first met
Wow. It's
at
our
the
anniversary.
IES annual conference.
Yeah.
Yes, it is in 2019,
You
and
didn't
that
send me
really
any
was
flowers.
Yeah.
uh, to be determined, to be determined. But yeah, no, that's what started this podcast, that meeting at the IS
Hmm.
annual conference in Kentucky. Um, but I think and we were talking about the term human centric lighting then,
Then, yeah, for
and
sure.
I hate the term
Yeah.
because it's all for humans anyway. So
Yeah.
I hate the term, and I think ecocentric lighting is a way better way of
There's a
thinking
lot.
about it.
There's
Mike, do you want to
integrative
jump in?
lighting, biocentric
Yeah.
lighting. There's a lot of different, just to let people know, NAILD is likely going to be calling a symposium on this topic to gather experts in industry together to the sponsor. NAILD is the sponsor of this show and the financial supporter. And we're thinking of calling a symposium because we've just had enough of all the different names and nobody knows what anybody else is talking about. No, seriously. Like when you say human centric, like what are you talking about? Are you talking about curing, skin diseases with light? Are you talking about, preventing slips and falls using lighting systems? Are you talking about roadway safety? Are you talking about, what are you talking about? Like, there's no, we're going to call a symposium. We're going to bring everyone together, and we're going to break this into different sections because there's all manner of different things that people are talking about when they say human-centric lighting. But the problem is that with the term is that it relegates everything else to distant secondary when you say human-centric lighting.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
it's just not when we're talking about outdoor lighting. Protecting natural darkness is human centric, right? So, we need more light. It's human centric is just a confusing term. And borderline offensive to people who care a lot about
Yes.
wildlife and are passionate about turtles or whatever. And turtles get all the play, but they're, stink bugs are important too. And these conversations get most difficult though. I think with the lighting conversations, the safety conversations, when someone dies. Okay.
And that's a huge issue. And yeah, you're right.
A lot of I hate to turn it back, and I know we're coming up on the end, but you talked a lot and Peter also mentioned this about the form of the reflectiveness or the lighting driving the recognition by the other person moving at high speeds. This really aids this. Does not highly bright uniform crosswalks, isn't that the opposite? Because when you see someone, like I find, there's two problems with crosswalks at night, I find. First of all, it puts the pedestrian into a state of maybe not being as aware as they should be of vehicle traffic, right? And the second thing is if you're under a really bright crosswalk, this is purely anecdotal for me, it's almost like you're lost in brightness. Whereas if that person was under a very poorly lit crosswalk, like one of those orange hanging signs we used to have in Ontario in the 80s, but wearing highly reflective gear, would they not be more noticeable to the driver than being under, say, 500 lux of light? I don't know.
First of all, 500 lux is...
Whatever, 40 lux.
Yeah.
Okay, 40 lux. I mean, I'm being ridiculous, but...
No, I'm just kidding. I was just trying to so I think there are two aspects. So one of the things is, so there's, and these things we're recently coming, we've been known about this, about the physics, about the contrast. And so what happens is so there's an interaction between overhead lighting and your vehicle headlamps. And sometimes, if it's not properly thought about, and we've started just looking at this in the last 3-4 years, is that there's a chance that under the impact of headlamps as well as the overhead lighting, the objects might disappear because the amount of light that is hitting them, if that is equal to the amount of light that is illuminated behind, basically the objects will disappear.
I have observed this effect on my own driving. I've observed it. Like I've noticed this. I'm like, I can't see that person that well, actually.
Yeah. And then, so one of the things is with this new study that we've just finished, and I unfortunately can't talk about it right now because it's still being reviewed, is that we are trying to address that and trying to figure out better ways to light crosswalks so that it doesn't involve the situation that you said. How do we count for the headlamps into consideration? And most of the times, headlamps are over the street crosswalk lighting is typically designed to make the pedestrian more visible to the driver. That which again begs to ask the question, what are the needs of the pedestrian here?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple of light sources that I've looked at where it's great for the driver. They can see it from 1,000 feet, 1,200 feet. But if I try to cross a road there's a huge glare bomb there.
Yes, totally agree. Totally agree.
And
the pedestrians are at the crosswalk, so they're assuming that the cars can see them, and they're less attentive than if they were just crossing down the street where there was not a crosswalk. It's a combination of factors there that are nuanced, and I don't think we understand them well enough.
And that's what we're trying to do, is trying to look at it. So there's a study that we're trying to look at it from a whole, we're trying to look at the adaptive dimming from a pedestrian point of view, not from a driver point. We've done enough studies from a driver point of view. Now we really want to get to the brass tacks and look at, hey, as a pedestrian, how comfortable do you feel? Do you feel safe enough? If you dim the lights, do you feel safe enough to walk, or do you think it's not safe? Or what do you? So we want to know all these things. So that's one of the goals, is to look at it from not only from a driver perspective, which has been a major focus of the research in the last 20 years. So we're trying to go away. In addition to that, we're trying to look at it from a pedestrian's point of view, so that how much light do they actually need? How much do they? What makes them more comfortable? So things like that. And then going back to the user-centric, I come from a human factors background, where I think that's where we coined the human-centric aspect of it. But when we did that, we were talking about a technology and human interface. We're looking at how do we make these rockets or these fighter jets more safe. And these are very mission critical systems. How do we make the software easy to interact with? How do we make that more user centric? that's kind of where that kind of term originated, where it made sense, right? It's technology and human interface, where that guy is flying this super expensive jet which can crash, or everybody can die, or he can die. So we're trying to, that's where the term originated from, the human-centric or the human factor or the user-centric aspect of it. Now, the term UX or user experience is like it's all over software and social media and everywhere. But then again, like lighting kind of has taken over the term, but it's right. But lighting is not like software. It doesn't only affect human beings. It affects everything else behind it. Like once you put a light there, it is gonna be unintended consequences, and then and the things that we started to look in more recently, we started to look more is about the unknown unknowns, right? The things that you don't know that you don't know. So and these things you really don't know until you really go out there and experience.
Which is most of all knowledge.
Yes. Perfect.
Yeah.
And that's the thing where we are, where we're trying to figure out, instead of again looking at it more like, okay, if you put a light there, what's the effect on sky glow, or what's the effect on this particular hawk moth that pollinates this really endangered orchid. So there's a case where these work zone lights, temporary lights, apparently they use work zones in like this really area in the summer. Most of the DOTs do these work zones in the summers because that's when this weather is good enough to do some road work to make the roads safer again. But then that particular light is disturbing this particular small moth, which is not pollinating an endangered orchid. So there's all these things that we really did not know about these things 20 years ago. But now it's slowly coming along. Sorry, I'm going over, but it's really important to take into account the entire picture when you design lighting, especially on roadways where you can't really control a lot of it. But you have to make sure that you design it in the perfect way so that you're trying to address most of the issues.
So, Raj, first of all, I want to thank you for actually taking the bull by the horns and actually doing evidence-based design with LEDs, because it's just direly needed. And we need to actually put research behind what we've actually done to the planet and figure out how we can do it better. And I love what you said before. You said a little bit of light goes a long way. And I wish that was the mantra for all exterior lighting at night. And you mentioned the known unknowns or the unknown knowns, or however you want to put it, and a lot of that is wildlife, because we are so human centric. We are so focused on ourselves, and so you are a prolific photographer. I follow you on Instagram. Your handle is what's your handle on Instagram?
RJ Bag, RJBHAG.
Yes. And you take photographs of birds, beautiful birds. So I want to close out the show by firstly just showing that you're a scientist who's also an artist. And I want to ask you, how has this connection to nature helped you in a meditative way, helped inform your work, help expand, your the purpose and intention of your work?
Thank you. And one of the things that I like birds. Number one, as a photographer, I know that they have more receptors in their eyes than us, and because they have an extra. In addition to some of the birds, in addition to having our 3 cones rods, like 3 types of cones we have in rods, they have an extra one for the UV. So our eyes, we cannot tell how they see the nature. We don't even know how they experience the world. And some studies have shown that we can't tell the difference between a male and a female bird. The only way you can tell the difference between a male and female bird is if you look through UV light, and then there's just small patterns that you cannot see on the male bird or the female bird. So,
wow.
So my fascination for lighting actually came from it comes from a photography point of view. It's all about how you tame the light to get the good picture you want, and that's kind of, again, that kind of feeds into my philosophy with research, is like, and if you can't oversaturate your picture to get a good picture, right? You need to have the right amount of light. And that's
Right.
that's kind of my philosophy. Is, again, goes back to the photography. You need the right amount of light to make a great picture, whether it's a bird, or it's a Milky Way, or if it's something else. And for me, it's more close because I do follow a lot of these birds that are very sensitive to light, and sometimes I have to get away and I have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and drive for like 3 hours to make sure that I'm there, and there's not a lot of lighting out there, and yeah, so that aspect of it, that the nature conservation aspect of it comes from my photography, to be able to make sure that we are providing enough space for these birds for them to thrive, for that ecosystem to thrive, and then again the whole concept of how light can be disruptive to how, like, if you are not careful about it, it can completely destroy your picture, or it can make a bad picture very quickly. So it's all about taming that light so that you can have very good picture. And the same thing applies to rubber. It's about having the right amount of light so that you can actually you're providing all the benefits that it does and minimizing all the negative effects of it.
Well, that's fascinating. And I was wondering how you got some of those shots because they're gorgeous. And listeners, if you're not following Raj already, he has gorgeous close-ups of birds that you get to see a color and a detail that you wouldn't normally get to see. So I didn't realize you were waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning to do that. And I'm also just, pleasantly surprised at your why. Of how your photography has informed your work. So thank you so much for coming on the show and bringing your wisdom and research and sharing it with us. We really appreciate your perspective.
Thank you so much. Thank you for letting me be a part of it, and I really enjoyed having the conversation with you. And we need to have more of these conversations with people outside the lighting and more natural resources, so that we can come up with better solutions to make it a better world.
Don't challenge us, Raj.
I think it's a great thing that you're doing.
Thank you.
It's really important to have these conversations, and it's really important to ask difficult questions.
Mm-hmm.
And as Young said, asking the right question is half the solution. So, So unless you ask these questions, you never really know. So yeah. And then the fact that you talked about flicker and roadway lighting is really important. Like I've never really thought about it from that point of view, but when I was thinking about the answer, I'm like, oh my, that's a point. So I actually learned something today while I was having a conversation with you guys. So thank you for that.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Starving for Darkness just finished up. I love that show so much, Greg Eric. What a hot blaster. But we got to talk about Evluma, the supporters of Starving for Darkness. EVLUMA.com. Hover over products and click dark sky friendly lighting. The magical Evluma, brother.
That's right. They're doing it right, and having the products you need to actually meet dark sky compliance or dark sky friendly facilities. They cover Kelvin temperature, lensing, diffusion, shields, dimming. Everything you need with two products, Area Max and OmniMax. So check that out.
Come on, folks. Go to evluma.com. That's EVLUMA.com. Hover over products and click dark sky friendly lighting. The Magicians. Starving for Darkness loves you. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.